Welcome to the Tanya Acker Show. John Ray is a lawyer for the families of Gilgo Beach victims, Shannan, Gilbert, and Jessica Taylor. And he and I had a conversation about current developments in the case, and we also talked about what went wrong and why these cases were cold for so very long. John Ray, you represent the families of Shannan Gilbert and Jessica Taylor. It was Shannan's disappearance, of course, that triggered the discovery or the investigation that led to the discovery of the four women. Three of those women have been connected to Rex Heuermann, who's now in custody. Shannan's death was not connected to Heuermann. If you wouldn't mind, just tell us what we know about Shannan's disappearance. What has been firmly established about her disappearance?
She is the first one to have been of those victims who were in Gilgo Beach and Oak Beach on Long Island. She's the first one to have been searched for as missing in that context, in that area. She's the last one to have been found. There were 10 others found before her. Those 10 others included Jessica Taylor and a baby and a cross-dressing young Asian male, and then some other females. So amongst whom are the four Gilgo, of which 3 have been charged against Heuermann. The other one, the fourth one, laid in a row with the others, is likely to be charged very soon, from what the district attorney says. When Shannan disappears, that triggers this whole series of events. She is an escort who comes from Jersey City, New Jersey, just over the border of New York. And she lives there with her boyfriend, Alex Diaz. And she was doing escort work in New Jersey until she got arrested there, and then turned her attentions to Manhattan, New York, Long Island, and more particularly searching to get into the wealthier man's market in Long Island. She went from Jersey City to Manhattan and driven from Manhattan out to Oak Beach in Suffolk County to John's house named Joseph Brewer. When she went across from Jersey City to Manhattan and then from Manhattan to Brewer, there were federal crimes being committed there certainly by Brewer, by her driver, Michael Pack, because they were crossing state lines for the purposes of engaging in this crime. We don't really know how the connection took place between Shannan and her driver and Brewer. We have Brewer's statement and we have Pack's statement about how it occurred. Their statements are very vague. They're not necessarily correct. But nonetheless, this hookup takes place on May 1st, 2010. So that was it was actually on a Saturday, early morning hours on Saturday. So she is driven out to Oak Beach, which is kind of a bungalow community that turned into a full-time year-round community and was once really the center of a lot of parties. It was kind of a happy party town with also the Oak Beach Inn, which was rather an infamous destination place right there at Oak Beach for drugs, alcohol, sex, you name it, all night, everything. She goes to Brewer's home, and after a fashion, she calls 911. Now, she was there at Brewer's house longer than the normal stint for a tryst, and that's because, according to Brewer, he sought extra hours with her. Although self-contradictorily, he said that he wouldn't have sex with her once he saw her because she looked like a man, and she mentioned something about sex with men, so it disgusted him. He never had sex with her. So he says. Shannan, who's an experienced escort, called the 911 operator and said, "Someone is after me." She repeated that 3 times. Didn't know where she was. She just knew she was on Long Island. And there's a 23-minute 911 tape recording that she made, basically. On that recording, you can hear that Shannan is trying to get away from someone who was after her. She is accosted within Brewer's home You can hear Brewer's voice. You can hear at some points Pack's voice, her driver, and you can hear other voices. Those other voices could very well be in the room where she was, or it could be upstairs, or it could be outside the house, either on the deck or on the driveway area, perhaps even in the backyard of Brewer's home. So Shannan is complaining with great upsetment that they're trying to kill her. She says, "They're trying to kill me." She repeats that several times.
During the 23 minutes that this 911 call lasted, were any emergency responders ever dispatched?
No responders were dispatched during the call. The responders ended up coming to the Oak Beach roughly 40 minutes after Shannan was last seen. She finally decides, stay in the house. Sophie's choice, stay in the house and wait for these people to come in and kill her, or go out, confront them, and run. She makes the right rational choice. She bolts. You can hear her doing that. You can hear her running. And then she is suddenly accosted, and there's a blood-curdling scream, a lengthy scream, which is really kind of several screams put in one. And she bolts from there. She manages to escape, knocks on doors, eventually knocking on a door of a man named Gus Coletti, who happened to be one of the board members for the association and was very closely associated with other people in the community, such as Dr. Peter Hackett and a man named Thomas Canning and a woman named Barbara Brennan. They were board members, very close, tight part of the community, tight fit together socially. She knocks on Coletti's door roughly 5:15, 5:20. He oddly confronts her with aggressive statements, and she then runs immediately from there. You can hear her go down the stairs, and then you don't hear any sound anymore. And that's the last we hear of her on the tape. Coletti tells a variety of stories, 4 different versions of what occurred, very self-contradictory versions. And Coletti's reason for that is given away by Coletti himself when he says to the reporter from the Star Ledger later on, the Star Ledger being a newspaper in New Jersey, "Ask me any questions you want, but don't ask me to give up my friends."
John, at what point is Shannan reported missing to the authorities?
Shannan is first reported missing the following day, that would be May 2nd on a Sunday, when Joseph Brewer, the John, called 911 3 times and reported her missing. Then it was her boyfriend, Alex Diaz, who went along with the driver, Michael Pack, to the police station. I believe Mary Gilbert, Shannan's mother, went with them, and they reported her missing at the local precinct. The precinct laughed them off, said, "Oh, don't worry, she's a prostitute, she'll turn up," and sent them to Jersey City. They said, you have to report her as a missing person from where she lived, which was Jersey City, New Jersey. So they went there and made the report. From there, May 3rd came, Monday. Diaz, that's the boyfriend, Alex Diaz, and Michael Pack, the driver, went looking for Shannan at Oak Beach again. And when they did that, they encountered Dr. Peter Hackett. Hackett never reported Shannan missing, even though he claimed that when he met these boys, it was his mission, and that's the word he used, to find her.
At what point do investigators say to her driver, "You've got to come and sit down and talk to us"? Same question for Brewer, her client that evening. When do the police say, "You are the last 2 folks who we know, or 2 of the last people that we know she had contact with before she disappeared. We need a statement from you on the record right now"? When does that happen?
We're not sure exactly when that happened. We do know that the police eventually interviewed Brewer and interviewed Pack and let them go, even though they were aware that these 2 men had committed crimes in bringing Shannan where they did. It was even weeks after she disappeared before they finally interviewed Brewer and Pack. And those interviews, by the way, were apparently done initially by the Missing Persons Bureau, not the Homicide Bureau.
You also indicated that at the entrance of this community where Brewer lived, there were cameras. At what point, if ever, do investigators say, let's grab these cameras so we can see whatever there may be to see? Do they ever try to secure that evidence?
Well, eventually they do. And depending upon whom you ask, we know that they didn't come, they being the police, didn't come for those security tapes until 18 days after Shannan had disappeared. That's the shortest period. If you listen to, for example, say Peter Hackett, that was his claim. But there are other people who say they didn't come for longer than that. Mrs. Hackett claimed that the tapes were erased after a week, automatically erased. However, the person in charge of the tapes in the security booth was Peter Hackett. The tapes were working at the time of this event, and Hackett variously claimed that he knew right away that the tapes were so important that he told nobody to touch them. If that were true, Peter Hackett, who was the former surgeon of Suffolk County Police Department, would have known to turn them over to the police immediately, and he didn't. And instead, he either erased them himself or he allowed them to be taped over before the police department came. And the police took their time getting there. So we do not have those tapes anymore.
Let's talk about some of the other evidence in the case. Some remnants or pieces of Shannan's clothing were found, as I understand it. And wasn't there a jacket or a coat of hers that went missing while in police custody?
Yes. As I mentioned before, certain of her belongings, her jeans, her pocketbook, her cell phone, or one of her cell phones, and her wallet, and a perfume bottle cap were located in the marsh behind Hackett's home in the catty corner to it. Her leather jacket apparently came off in the struggle outside Brewer's home because it was laying in the driveway. Now, depending who you listen to, Brewer claims that it had been laying there. He told the police about it, and the police never came for it, and after 2 weeks, he discarded it. That's different than what the police themselves say. When I went to the autopsy meeting with the medical examiner regarding Shannan in April or May of 2012, months later, the assistant medical examiner pronounced that the police had taken the jacket and lost it.
Was any explanation given for how it was lost? Just nothing. We'd taken it and we can't find it.
No explanation as to how the jacket was lost. It seems to be gone forever. And certainly that jacket and who touched it would have been extremely important.
Shannan's death had been ruled by authorities as a drowning. Now, is that consistent with the injuries that were discovered on her body? Wasn't there evidence of trauma on her body, which could have come from could have been a result of the drowning? But how do you reconcile the official explanation of her death with what you know of the case? And, you've been at this for a pretty long time now.
Yeah, I've been at it for 12 years. The first explanation offered by the Commissioner of Police for Suffolk County, Commissioner Dormer, was that once they had located the jeans and the pocketbook, it was that Shannan had drowned, although they had not yet located her remains. So it's kind of an astounding conclusion without evidence of any kind that she had drowned. Several days later, when she was located, they changed their story, and then they said, well, nope, it wasn't that she drowned, but she died of natural causes in the wilderness of the marsh. When the commissioner was challenged by a reporter about how did the jeans, tight jeans, come off in the marsh, he claimed, amazingly, that she likely was running through the marsh and the sticker bushes, the bramble bushes, pulled the jeans off. That was his explanation. Beyond absurd. Those were the first two conclusions. The police never performed nor did the medical examiner, any test to see if she had drowned. There's a test you could take of her bone that is expensive, but they never did it. The evidence is overwhelming that she did not drown. In fact, she's laying up, face up, on a bush in the marsh where her remains. It's pretty hard to drown face up. Then they claimed natural causes because it was in early May. She could have, gotten cold. And of course, that's assuming the marsh is really a very amazingly jungle-like place where you just couldn't get out once you got in. So I walked the marsh from where the police believed she entered it to where her body was. And I did it in the month of May, the very first week of May, the same time Shannan would have walked it if that turned out to have been true. And, I went in with ropes and people. We had a woman come in who was Shannon's size, and we wore fatigue coats and so on. We were ready for the worst because the commissioner was claiming it was a wilderness with, dangerous animals and quicksand and so forth. So we went in, and of course, none of that was true. It was very, very difficult to get in, first of all, even at the point where they claimed she entered it. So that itself was an absurd obstacle that she would have not faced on that morning and tried to overcome. And as you go through the marsh, you realize that, first of all, at the time she would have entered it, you can time it based upon the phone calls that she made and Brennan made. It was already twilight, and dawn was only about 10 minutes away. So it wasn't dark. And if she got all the way across the marsh by herself somehow to where she ended up, about a third of a mile away going through the marsh, say it took another 45 minutes. It was bright sunlight when she would have died under their explanation. In other words, the explanation makes no sense. In addition, at no time while you're walking through that marsh was it true that you could not see civilization. To the left, to the north, you could hear the car tires going on the Ocean Parkway early in the morning, I guess, going to work. You could see the overhead lights, the traffic light, the light poles, and you could see the car lights. And to the right, to the south, toward the bay and the ocean, you could see houses all along Oak Beach. You could even see into the windows of people having coffee. So even if the reeds got in your way, it wasn't too hard to hear and see that civilization was nearby. It would take an amazing act of self-willed death to die as she did, and there's no evidence that she killed herself whatsoever. So what's the explanation? If you take the circumstances, the explanation collectively is hugely in favor of homicide. Not only because she calls 911, says she's being followed, says she's about to be killed, runs, bolts, disappears. Her clothes are left in a different place than where she is, or some of her clothing in her pocketbook. And then she's found in the condition she's found are enough to tell you that homicide is the greatest likelihood. However, we also then, in 2016, I found an old friend, Michael Bodden, who is the world-renowned medical examiner, the number one in the world. And luckily, I had played semi-professional football with his brother, Bobby. And Bobby helps him with his autopsies. So he graciously agreed to do pro bono work with me. And we were able, I had to fight the county to get her bones. I got the bones, and we brought them to a funeral parlor where we, performed what's left of an autopsy. And we were able to see that the hyoid bone in the neck, it's a little, very small U-shaped bone in your neck. It's the only bone that's not connected to any other bone. And we were able to see the hyoid bone. If the hyoid bone is fractured in any way, then it's a sign of strangulation. And in strangulation of women, whenever they're strangled or hung, their hyoid bone breaks 99 or something, 90% of the time, something like that. And this hyoid bone was there, but the horns on the bone were broken off And on one side, it was all jagged. In other words, it got fractured. In the center of the bone, which is the base of the bone, if you picture it in a U shape, at the base, there was a round hole that went right through the bone. The county had reported that it was a dent. That was not accurate. It was a hole. You could see right through it. It was a pretty circular hole that went right, which is unnatural. It doesn't belong there. Dr. Bodden said that his findings were that her death was consistent with homicide and inconsistent with natural causes. That's what he said. And he was the medical examiner for Suffolk County for 2 years. So for the county to ignore, and for the police to ignore that evidence is stunning. But that's what they're doing.
Has there been any effort to revisit any of this evidence in light of Heuermann's arrest? I know, again, that Heuermann has not yet been or hasn't been connected to Shannan's disappearance, but has there been any effort to revisit any of these earlier findings?
There's been no effort to revisit any of the earlier findings yet. There's a lot more evidence than what I've described to you, all of which is consistent with the narrative that she was murdered. And I have it. And I have in the past presented a body of it to the police who rejected it, would refuse to even look at it. Now we have the new district attorney, the new commissioner of police, the new task force. Perhaps they will look at it again. Now, so far, the police commissioner, in keeping with the police investigation that took place, the disgraceful investigation that took place, he has said, well, there's no new evidence. As far as we're concerned, she died of a tragic accident. Of course, these are homicide detectives who deal their lives in evidence, and they know they have to have evidence, always evidence to convict. So there's suffused this, they're immersed in evidence, and yet without a scintilla of evidence, they declare her to have drowned, to have died of a tragic accident. They don't identify the accident. They have no evidence that she died of an accident. They have, beaucoup evidence that she did not die of an accident, and they declare that she dies of an accident. There's something very, very wrong with that process. So we hope, I have enough confidence right now in the current task force. We're hoping that finally the task force will do the right thing, reopen this, and get back into it. At my urging, I have, a lot of very poignant evidence, and I've been doing this for 41 years, this kind of work. I think I've, the respect of the district attorney, very much so, who I've known many years. I have enough to go back to him and say, Ray Tierney, take a look at this. Let's reopen this and see what happens.
Has he responded to, have you made that overture to him yet?
No, I have not. I waited for, I let him basically have his space. I've spoken with Rodney Harrison. I met with him early on in his career, in his commissionerhood, about a year ago, February. He came to visit me at my office, and that's when he agreed, finally, to release the audio tapes, copies of which I had. I had to fight through the courts and through appeals, 2 of them, to get the tape. It took years. I got it. I got the other tapes as well, but I wasn't, ironically, allowed to use them except in the case. So they were basically useless. I needed the police commissioner to release them, and he did. So that broke the ice. But after that, nothing else happened.
So Shannan goes missing in May of 2010. Remains are discovered in December of 2011. Shannan's mother, who very sadly has passed away, really has to push to get authorities to pay attention. How do you get involved? How do you start to represent the family?
Well, there had been a murder, actually a mass murder, that took place in Suffolk County in the town of Medford, where a man named Laffer, who was a oxycodone addict, broke into a drugstore that was dealing heavily in oxycodone, or walked in, actually, while there were customers there, and shot assassinated 5 people. One of the persons assassinated, Jamie Tissetta, had children at home, 2 little children. And at Laffer's sentencing, when he was caught with his wife and at their sentencing, I was asked by the family of the 2 little girls to speak on behalf of the little girls, on behalf of the victims, because they couldn't speak for themselves. And so what I did at the sentencing of Laffer, I became the 2 little girls. I, channeled them, as it were, and spoke about playing with Barbies and, waiting for Mama to come home, and she never comes. And this I did, effectively, I think. So one of the news reporters who was at the sentencing from the Daily News in New York approached me and said, look, there's this woman named Mary Gilbert who would also like your help in her case, which was the case of Shannan Gilbert. So I met Mary Gilbert with the reporter from the Daily News at a bar in Islip in Suffolk County, and I agreed to represent her in doing one thing, and that was to try to get the FBI to intervene in the investigation and get the Suffolk County Police to back down, get away, because they had bungled it so badly. Well, we held a press conference to that effect. I wrote a letter to the United States Attorney asking them to intervene. Nothing was done. We were, signally ignored, and the U.S. Attorney never wrote back. We later found out that it was, we were basically shut down by the new Suffolk Police Chief, James Burke, who was morally corrupt and criminal man who had a predilection for the solicitation and use of escorts. And he was in charge of the investigation of the death of escorts. So think about that. And he came in, shut down the investigation, pushed out all the other authorities that were investigating, isolating the Suffolk County Police and letting them carry the ball alone. We found out subsequent to that, although I continued to criticize the police, we found out that the police had assigned to this vast investigation that was a huge, news story for day after day, week after week, of the 11 people who were dead. They had assigned exactly 1 detective who worked part-time on the job on this case. And that was true right up until Rodney Harrison took office a little over a year ago. So you get a real flavor for what the Suffolk County Police Department did under these circumstances.
Interstate crimes, a desperate 911 phone call, evidence of clothing found at the scene, but no FBI involvement. FBI is being blocked by Burke because, you point out, he was in quite a situation himself. Wasn't Burke being himself investigated by the FBI, which is why he wanted to keep that agency at arm's length? Am I right about that?
Yes. There's evidence that Burke suppressed the investigation on purpose and drove the FBI out. He also drove the state police out, and he drove the New Jersey City police out. They were doing a missing persons investigation as to Shannan, and they were doing a very good job of it. And they were all shut down, and so was Nassau County Police as well. So Burke basically isolated Suffolk County for whatever his reasons.
Unfortunately and very sadly, Mary Gilbert passed away very tragically. What was law enforcement saying, before she gets you involved? What was her experience with law enforcement? Were they just ignoring her? Were they saying what they said to the families of some of the other victims, because she was a sex worker, you got to wait longer to file the report, or we're not going to take the report? What was her relationship with law enforcement like before you came on board?
Mary Gilbert's approach to law enforcement was respectful, and she relied completely on the Suffolk County Police to investigate. She actively sought to have them do the investigation and was more or less in regular contact with them regarding it, to no avail. That's when she brought me in 8 days after Shannan's remains were found to get them out and get the FBI in if we could. And parenthetically, I stayed in the case because a few days after I held that press conference, a detective in the Homicide Bureau from Suffolk County wrote me a letter, single-spaced 2 pages, that explained in detail, somewhat detail, what was on the 911 tape, and also wrote it on police union stationery. So here was a dyed-in-the-wool detective who would never go outside of his regulations, going outside of all regulations, revealing evidence during an investigation, and doing it on union stationery, and claiming that Shannan was calm at all times, that the other people in the room were calm at all times. Nobody was being threatened. There was no danger that she was in whatsoever, and she was acting irrationally. That's what his letter said. And then he went, and after he criticized me heavily in that letter, he took that letter and published it as a feature letter in Newsday, so that the official police narrative was unofficially put on the street by them in that fashion for the next 12 years. Those statements by this detective turned out to be outright falsehoods, as we all now know from hearing the tape. I knew they were falsehoods when we went to the medical examiner in April or May of 2012, and she announced that there was a struggle on the tapes, that Shannan was excited and felt threatened. She didn't tell us about the screams, but she did tell us what I just said, which is completely contradictory to what the police had said. So we knew the police were lying about what happened. We never knew why. To this day, I still don't know really why. You can surmise many things, a lot of inferences, but we're not sure of exactly what drove that. But there's no doubt that they outright lied to me and to the public. That's what kept me in the case. I stayed in it, and then I started the lawsuit against Peter Hackett, and here we are. But as far as Mary is concerned, once I get in it, I kind of ran the ball after that. But until now, but Mary was still committed to finding her daughter, and then her other daughter being driven mad by the loss of her sister, whom she adored and worshipped, lost her mind and killed her mother. So I became the lawyer for Sarah, the daughter that did the killing, because she was insane, and I was trying to help the family.
You also represent the family of Jessica Taylor. This year marks 20 years since Jessica's body was found. Has any progress been made in that investigation?
There's been progress we've made with information we've had, and we've turned it over to the police. And the police independently have done, their work to some degree on that. But there's still a lot more work to be done. And now with the new task force, we're seeing a reactivation of looking at the evidence in that investigation by the police. So we're optimistic that they'll do their job correctly and get this done. But that's as far as I could say we've gone.
Before you go, John, it strikes me that these cases, what happened to these women, really is emblematic of a number of different types of failures. There are systemic failures in how victims are treated when they are in the sex industry. There also seem to be some very idiosyncratic things about this case. We have a police investigator who was himself being investigated and stymied help from other agencies. And it turns out, as we see from the work of this task force, that it's the interagency cooperation that really helped crack things open. You say you are optimistic, and again, recognizing that there are some unique factors that may be at play with respect to the different folks who are involved here. But are you optimistic that systemically law enforcement and investigators and institutions will do a better job of protecting women and people in this circumstance? Are you optimistic that we will do a better job looking out for classes of victims who are so regularly and easily discarded?
It's a harder question to answer easily, of course. The police officer who was then, I think, the chief of patrol or chief of police of the county force back then, I think his statement was along the lines that, don't worry, to Suffolk County residents, the serial killer is picking on women from a certain class, so you have nothing to worry about. And when that was said, of course, you can well imagine the reaction to that. And that I think describes or defines the attitude of the police department at that time. Now, does that change over time? We hope, with education and so forth. I don't know, but experience perhaps. But, that attitude was deeply rooted in the police department for these reasons. I think first that in no particular order, these people that they're talking about, they perceive naturally, because the law says so, as criminals. So they treat criminals differently than they treat others. And that's true of every criminal. But then when you deal with the crime of prostitution, and the practice of it, the low esteem that the police hold for these people drops significantly because of the nature of what they're doing. And so the police tend to lose, I think, as do members of society, the sense that these women are human, that they are deserving of attention and deserving of the protection of the law, at least, and that they are themselves victims of the very system that they find themselves caught in, very often victims of drug addiction, victims of other problems like that, sometimes mental disorders and the like, that people suffer, but they take a different course. And because these women take this course, and very often not on their own, very often recruited into the system by sex traffickers, they're treated as if they're completely monsters at fault for everything which happens to them. So good riddance to them is the attitude. That attitude is going to be always hard to change because the law doesn't change. And people are people. They'll always have those kinds of bad attitudes, but we can perhaps mitigate them and, temper them by recognizing the humanity of these poor girls who foolishly or recklessly or unintentionally or sadly were dragged into this system. I look at them as children of God, and no matter their age, and they are deserving of the same protection that Mary Magdalene, the saint that was supposedly a prostitute, the kind of protection she ultimately received. So I say the same for these girls. They should be treated in the same fashion.
I think what's interesting and important to remember is that these were women who had plans and families and hopes and dreams. In some cases, really saw the sex work as a temporary thing that would hopefully be a path to something better. And for the victims, unfortunately, it didn't work out like that. John Ray, I wish you the best of luck in seeking justice for Shannan, and I hope you'll come back and keep us all posted.
I will.